The fluorescent lights at Oak Creek Memorial buzzed like angry wasps trapped in plastic. 11:47 p.m. That's when Katie Morrison clocked in for another 12-hour shift, her badge hanging from a lanyard beside a trauma shear with no markings, no engraving, just the dull silver of equipment that had seen things. Her scrubs were the same blue as 1,000 other nurses in Philadelphia, her dark hair pulled back tight enough to leave a faint mark on her temples, her shoes worn at the heels from 5 years of ER floors. Nobody looking at her would have seen the military posture in her shoulders, the way she walked on the balls of her feet, the precise way she set things down as if they might explode if touched wrong. The ER was controlled chaos at midnight. 3 stab wounds in Bay 2, a possible stroke in observation, a drunk driver being processed in Bay 4. The usual. Katie moved through it like water, no rushing, no panic, just the quiet certainty of someone who'd already worked in places where patients died without monitors, without fours, without hope. She checked the assignment board. 6 beds. She was starting on Bay 7, a patient who hadn't arrived yet, admitted through the ED scanner but not yet wheeled through the doors. Vital signs unknown. History unknown. Just a name and a diagnosis code. Dr. Pierce Caldwell stood at the nurse's station reviewing charts, his white coat hanging on him like a designer garment, his reading glasses suspended from a chain that probably cost more than Katie's monthly rent. He'd been running the ED for 14 years, the kind of doctor who knew the names of all the surgeons downtown but not the names of the nurses who actually kept patients breathing. He didn't look up when Katie passed. Nobody ever did. She was competent. Invisible. Exactly how she preferred it. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and anxiety. Katie grabbed fresh linens for Bay 7, her hand steady, economical, the hands of someone trained to function when everything else was falling apart. She'd been an RN for 23 years, but nobody at Oak Creek knew that yet. They thought she'd been here 3 years, that she'd come from a surgical unit upstate, that her nursing credentials were impeccable because they were. Everything was verifiable. Everything was buried. Bay 7 was ready at 12:14 a.m. when the ambulance alert came through. Male patient, 28 years old, IED blast injury, spinal cord trauma, multiple lacerations. Admitted from Ramadi Field Hospital through the Pentagon Medical Transfer Program. Katie felt her breath catch for exactly 1 second before she pushed it down. Ramadi. That word didn't appear in the ER very often anymore. Not in 2024. Not when that war had ended years ago for most people, had never ended for others. The stretcher came through the automatic doors at 12:16. 2 paramedics, 1 on each side, moving with practiced efficiency. The patient was young, his face tight with pain, his legs unmoving beneath the blanket that covered him from the waist down. His right arm was wrapped in gauze that showed spots of fresh blood. His left hand gripped something like a lifeline, an old jacket, faded olive drab, the kind issued to soldiers who served in the desert. Katie watched his hand shake as the stretcher rolled past her, and she felt something in her chest reorganize itself. Bay 7, the paramedic called out, and Katie was already moving, already at the bedside, already scanning the patient's face for recognition that wouldn't come. His eyes were dark, focused on the ceiling, not on the nurse who'd just entered his sphere of consciousness. She began the vitals check with the kind of silence that came from muscle memory. Pulse. Respiration. Blood pressure. The jacket, he still held it. Olive drab. And there, visible where the lining had worn thin on the inside of the collar, stitched with thread that had faded from black to gray, was a unit patch. She recognized the insignia immediately. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. Her unit patch. The one she hadn't looked at in 20 years. Katie's hands trembled. Tiny, almost invisible, but trembled. She felt the shock move through her like an electrical current. 20 years. The math didn't work. This man was 28. He would have been 8 years old during Operation Phantom Fury. Unless this was someone else from that unit. Unless this was a coincidence so astronomically unlikely that her brain refused to process it. She turned away from the bed. Controlled breathing. 3 counts in, hold for 4, 6 counts out. The anxiety pattern they'd taught her in combat medicine. When your patient is dying and you can't afford to panic. When your hands have to stay steady even though your mind is screaming. She turned back to the monitor, pulled up the admission form on the computer. Marcus Chen. That name meant nothing. No recognition flickered. But that patch was from her platoon. From the Phi base in the Jolin district. From 18 years ago when she was a different person in a different uniform carrying a different name. Dr. Caldwell appeared beside the bed like he'd materialized from the wall itself. He was watching her. She felt his attention the way you feel a gun pointed at your back. His eyes moved from the patient to Katie's face, lingering on her hands, which were steady again. Steady for exactly 3 seconds after she'd touched the monitor. Fast. Not fast enough that he wouldn't have noticed the initial tremor. Not fast enough that he wouldn't ask himself why a floor nurse's hand shook at the sight of a new patient. "You've got this one, Morrison." His voice was casual, the way a hawk sounds casual when it's circling. He was using her last name, not her first. She'd noticed he did that when he was thinking about someone, working out a problem, deciding if they were a problem. "Yes, doctor." She didn't look at him. She was checking the patient's full line, already running normal saline, the bag hanging from the metal pole like a small translucent miracle. The paramedics had done good work. Access was established. Fluids flowing. But something was wrong with the patient's breathing. It was too shallow. The expansion of his chest was minimal, almost fractional. She could see it in the rise and fall that wasn't quite rising and falling enough. "Get the respiratory assessment completed within the hour," Caldwell said. "I'll be in the physician's lounge if you need anything." He left. Just like that. But he'd left something behind, something invisible but present, a mark in the air where he'd stood. She could feel it like a scent, a warning that he was thinking about her now. That she'd registered on his radar. That whatever had happened to her hands, whatever he'd seen in her reaction to that jacket, had made him curious. And Dr. Caldwell with questions was dangerous in a way that most people didn't understand. Katie turned her full attention to Marcus Chen. His eyes were still on the ceiling, unaware that the nurse checking his vitals had just held his life in her hands in a different country, a different lifetime. "I'm Katie," she said quietly. "I'll be monitoring your breathing tonight. If anything changes, you tell me immediately. Understand?" He nodded slightly, his voice rough. "Yeah. Thanks." She moved through the assessment with the kind of precision that came from training no floor nurse was supposed to have. Respiratory rate, 16 per minute. Too slow. Oxygen saturation, 94% on room air. Borderline. She made a note in the chart. Flagged it for the respiratory therapist. Did everything a competent nurse would do and nothing more. But as she left the bay and returned to the nurse's station, she could still see that patch. That faded patch with her unit's insignia stitched into the lining. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins, that something had shifted. The patient in Bay 7 wasn't just another admission. He was something worse. He was a door opening to a past she'd spent 20 years keeping sealed. The monitor in Bay 7 beeped softly, the sound like a clock beginning to count down toward something neither of them could yet imagine. Katie pulled up his chart again, committing every detail to memory. But what the screen didn't show, what no computer system in Philadelphia had access to, was the truth sitting in the back of her mind like an unexploded device. She knew exactly who Marcus Chen was. She'd known the moment she saw the unit patch. And if Caldwell was already watching her, if he'd already noticed something wrong with her reaction, then the next 8 hours were going to require her to be someone she'd spent 2 decades learning not to be. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. The overhead page crackled through Oak Creek Memorial at 0600 hours, a sound like static tearing through fabric. Katie band-aid Morrison to administration. The entire ER staff looked up from their stations. A resident snickered, a small, cruel sound that carried across the trauma bay like a pebble thrown into still water. Band-Aid. The nickname landed exactly where Caldwell intended it to land, a childhood taunt resurrected, weaponized, broadcast through hospital speakers to ensure maximum humiliation. Katie set down the clipboard she'd been holding. Her jaw tightened. One measured breath. She walked toward administration with the same deliberate pace she used to walk through minefield terrain, each step calculated, controlled, betraying nothing. Before she reached the administrative offices, Caldwell intercepted her near the pharmacy corridor. He didn't speak. Just gestured her into a supply closet, the kind with metal shelves and the smell of antiseptic so sharp it burned the back of her throat. The door closed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. "I saw you yesterday," Caldwell said. His voice was low, venomous, a voice like a knife being sharpened. "Near the secure pharmacy. Looking through doorways you have no business approaching." Katie met his eyes. Composure. Always composure. "I was retrieving crash cart supplies for Trauma Bay 3. You were snooping." He stepped closer, invading her space, a classic dominance play, the kind of move men made when they needed to feel bigger than they were. "And if you stir up trouble, if you mention anything you think you saw to anyone, I will personally ensure you're scrubbing bedpans in the geriatric ward until you quit. You understand me?" Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. But something inside her fractured, just slightly. A single tear escaped down her left cheek, not from fear, not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of restraint. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Her voice, when she spoke, was like still water reflecting starlight. "My patient care speaks louder than your insecurity, doctor." The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. His face flushed crimson. He pointed at the door. "Get out." She walked out. 2 hours later, as the morning shift arrived at 0800 hours and the parking lot filled with nurses and residents and orderlies clocking in for another 12-hour rotation, Caldwell made his move. He intercepted Katie near the employee entrance, 17 staff members close enough to hear every word. The sky above Philadelphia was a gray that matched the concrete, rain threatening but not yet falling. Effective immediately, Caldwell announced, his voice pitched to carry, "Katie Morrison is removed from charge nurse duties. Floor assignments only. No trauma cases. No code responses. That's final." A physician assistant whispered something to another nurse. They both glanced at Katie. She stood perfectly still, her hospital badge dangling from the lanyard around her neck, the faded lettering worn from 3 years of shifts. Caldwell continued, his voice dropping into that patronizing register that men like him perfected. "We need nurses who understand their limitations. Not floor nurses playing pretend." She didn't flinch. Didn't defend. Didn't raise her voice. She nodded once, a small, controlled movement, and walked back inside. Her hands began to tremble as she signed the demotion paperwork in the HR office, the pen moving in precise, deliberate strokes despite the slight vibration in her fingers. Not from fear. From restraint. From the effort of keeping buried what needed to stay buried. The paper signed itself to her downfall, and she watched it happen with the same calm she'd watched mortars arc across Ramadi's sky. But that wasn't the worst part. Marcus Chen's breathing grew labored at hour 3 of his ER stay. Katie checked his oxygen saturation from the post-op station where she'd been reassigned, SpO2 dropping from 96 to 92. She paged respiratory therapy. A therapist arrived, adjusted the oxygen delivery to non-rebreather, checked the patient's tube placement. Then his phone rang. He answered. His expression changed. He excused himself and left the ER, never returning. Caldwell had reassigned the respiratory therapist to ICU. A simple phone call. Competent. Clean. Katie documented the deterioration every 30 minutes without being asked. Hour 5, respiratory rate climbing from 18 to 24 breaths per minute. Marcus's ribs pulled with accessory muscle use, his body working harder than it should. She approached the attending physician, not Caldwell, an older woman named Dr. Chen, no relation, and reported the findings. Dr. Caldwell is overseeing this case personally, the attending said gently. He's ordered conservative observation. Let's give it time. Hour 6, Marcus's lips showed the first hint of cyanosis, that blue-gray tinge that meant oxygen wasn't reaching where it needed to go. Katie requested a chest X-ray from the radiology department, filled out the order form herself, submitted it to the system. Caldwell appeared 3 minutes later, his presence making the air pressure change, the way apex predators carry that unseen weight even in stillness. He reviewed the chart. Denied the X-ray. The patient is stable, he said. Focus on your assigned duties, Nurse Morrison. She opened her mouth. She had the words ready, SpO2 dropping, respiratory rate elevated, possible pneumothorax, we need imaging, but Caldwell leaned close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne he wore over whatever else made him exactly what he was. I've already made 3 calls to the hospital board tonight, he whispered. About a concerning nurse with boundary issues. About your inappropriate attachment to patients. About your general unsuitability for charge duties. Don't make it 4. He walked away. Katie documented the denial. She did not cry. She did not tremble. She stood still for exactly 7 seconds, then returned to her assigned duties. Hour 7, the duty roster refreshed on the unit secretary's computer. Katie's name disappeared from all trauma assignments. All code responses. All ICU overflow protocols. She was now permanently assigned to post-op recovery, the safest, quietest, most distant location from the ER proper. Caldwell wasn't just removing her from helping Marcus. He was removing her from the hospital's center of gravity, from any position of authority, from any place where she might see anything she shouldn't see. But the ER had a long hallway that ran past post-op recovery. And from that hallway, Katie could see into trauma bay 2. She could see Marcus. His oxygen mask fogged irregularly now, the pattern telling her what she needed to know without vital signs. Respiratory distress. Hypoxemia. The boy, because he was still the boy to her, even at 28 years old, even paralyzed and broken, shifted in the bed, his face twisted with effort. And in that motion, in that bone structure, in the shape of his jaw, Katie recognized something that had lived in her muscle memory for 2 decades, the 8-year-old she'd pulled from rubble during the firefight in Ramadi, the child she'd carried 3 miles through enemy fire while her team provided covering fire, the boy whose name she'd never known because the medevac had taken him and she'd never heard what happened to him. She'd survived Ramadi. The boy had survived Ramadi. And then life had broken both of them in different ways, and somehow or impossibly, against all odds, they'd both ended up in this hospital at this moment, and now someone was ensuring she couldn't help him. Hour 8 began at 1,400 hours. Marcus's chest rose and fell with visible effort. Each breath cost him something. Katie stood in the post-op hallway, watching him from a distance she was no longer permitted to cross, and made a choice. The trembling in her hand stopped. Her breathing deepened. The nurse in scrubs, the one who'd learned to be someone she wasn't, the one who'd buried herself in civilian work for 2 decades, stepped away. What walked toward Trauma Bay 2 moved differently. Moved like someone who'd crossed hostile terrain in the dark. Moved like someone who'd held a dying child and refused to let go. Marcus Chen had been in the ER for 8 hours. 8 hours of monitors beeping their indifferent rhythm, 8 hours of his oxygen saturation creeping downward like a tide going out, 8 hours while Dr. Caldwell made calculated decisions that had nothing to do with medicine. Katie knew this without anyone telling her. She could read it in the way his chest moved, asymmetrical now, the right side rising with effort while the left lagged behind like it was remembering how to breathe. She could read it in the color of his lips, that faint dusky blue that meant his blood wasn't carrying enough oxygen anymore. She could read it in the way his eyes followed her as she moved through the trauma bay, desperate and confused, the paralyzed veteran from Ramadi watching a stranger's face like it might contain answers. The monitor showed his O2 sat at 87%. It had been 92 when he arrived. Katie pulled up his chart on the tablet mounted beside his bed. The respiratory therapy notes from the initial assessment were there: a brief evaluation, a recommendation for continuous monitoring, nothing more. No follow-up note. No reassessment scheduled. No therapy orders in the system for the past 6 hours. That should have been impossible. Patients with respiratory compromise didn't just get forgotten in a level 1 trauma center. Patients didn't sit unmonitored while their oxygen levels dropped in quarter-point increments. She had no idea what was about to unfold. Katie moved to the bedside, her movements precise and controlled, nothing hurried or emotional. She pressed her fingers against the pulse oximetry probe on Marcus's finger, checking for poor perfusion that might cause a false low reading. The sensor was clean. The reading was accurate. His oxygen saturation had genuinely fallen 3 percentage points in the past 40 minutes. She reached for the phone mounted on the wall beside the trauma bed and paged respiratory therapy. Code 4. Priority call. A patient with declining oxygen saturation who needed immediate reassessment. 2 minutes later, Marcus's monitor showed 84%. The respiratory therapist who appeared at the bay entrance was a man named Chen, no relation, though Marcus lifted his eyes with a moment of confused hope, with 17 years of experience and calloused fingers that had inserted countless endotracheal tubes. He was competent. He was fast. He took one look at Marcus, listened to his breath sounds with a stethoscope, and his expression shifted into that flat, professional calm that meant he'd identified a problem. Asymmetrical breath sounds, Chen said, running his hand across Marcus's right ribs. Decreased air entry left side. We need a portable chest X-ray stat, and I'm going to get a 14-gauge angiocath ready for potential needle decompression if this gets worse. Katie nodded. This was the system working. This was a patient about to get the intervention he needed. Chen reached for his equipment bag and was halfway to gathering a thoracostomy kit when his radio crackled. Respiratory therapy, please respond. Go ahead, Chen said. We need you in ICU Bay 7. Ventilator crisis. Patient desaturating rapidly. Abandon current assignment and respond immediately. Katie watched Chen's face. He glanced at Marcus. For a moment she saw him calculating, a patient already declining versus a patient actively crashing. ICU was always higher priority. I'll be right back, Chen said to Katie. Get the chest X-ray. I'll reassess in 5 minutes. He was gone before she could respond. Before she could say that 5 minutes might be too long. Before she could argue that Marcus was already moving toward the edge of a cliff and stepping away now meant missing the moment when he fell. Katie pulled the portable X-ray machine to the bedside and positioned the lead shield across Marcus's lower body. The X-ray tech who'd appeared to operate the machine moved with practiced efficiency, took the image, and was gone. She stood alone with Marcus and the monitors that now showed 82% oxygen saturation. She went to find Chen in ICU Bay 7. The curtain was drawn, but she could hear voices inside, not emergency voices, not crisis voices. She could hear Caldwell's voice, smooth and commanding. I need you here for at least the next 3 hours. This patient is unstable and requires continuous respiratory assessment. Chen's voice, apologetic, I have another patient I was evaluating. This patient is actively critical. The trauma bay patient is stable. Priorities, Mr. Chen. I'm sure you understand. Katie stood outside the curtain, her jaw clenched once, then releasing. She didn't go back to Marcus immediately. She went to the charge nurse station instead and pulled up the duty roster on the computer. She was still listed as primary nurse for Trauma Bay 4. That made sense. She'd been with Marcus since his arrival, knew his history, understood his baseline. She scrolled to tomorrow's assignments and stopped. Tomorrow, her name wasn't on the trauma list. Tomorrow she was scheduled for post-op recovery. The day after that, she was on phlebotomy rotation. The day after that, clerical work in medical records. Her name had been systematically removed from every critical care assignment through the next 2 weeks. The roster had been updated at 20:47 hours. 30 minutes after she'd washed out of the supply closet, Dr. Caldwell's office behind her? She returned to Marcus. 80% now. His breathing had become audible, a soft struggle that filled the small space around his bed like weather coming in. His eyes had that glassy quality that meant his brain wasn't getting the oxygen it needed to think clearly anymore. He was fading into hypoxia, slipping millimeter by millimeter toward a state where his body would simply stop fighting. Katie pulled the chart and checked the call's log. There it was, a call to the hospital administrator at 2,103 hours. Another call to the chief of medicine at 2,127 hours. Then a message flagged in the system concerning boundary violations by nursing staff. Recommend immediate investigation and restricted duties pending HR review. The message was dated 2,145 hours. Signed by Dr. Caldwell. Flagged as urgent. She understood then. She understood completely. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't oversight. This was precision. Caldwell had placed Marcus in a room he wasn't monitoring. He'd paged respiratory therapy and then recalled them. He'd altered the duty roster to remove her from trauma assignments. He'd made calls that would tie up the hospital's administrative attention, that would create documentation of her as a problem employee, that would make any complaint she filed look like a retaliation claim. He was constructing a narrative where nothing that happened to Marcus was his responsibility, where Katie Morrison was the unstable, boundary-violating nurse who'd let a patient deteriorate while she was too emotionally compromised to function. It was brilliant, in a terrible way. It was competent sabotage. 80%. 79%. The oxygen saturation continued its slow descent like a dying pulse. Katie's hands became very still. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint. She was holding down something vast and military-grade inside her chest, something that had survived 3 tours and 2 Purple Hearts and the kind of trauma that normal people didn't recover from. She was holding it down through force of will and training and the memory of every oath she'd ever taken. Marcus needed her calm. Marcus needed her operational. She took a breath and moved to his bedside, checking his chest expansion, listening to his breath sounds herself with the stethoscope she carried in her pocket. Asymmetrical breathing. Decreased air entry left side. Tension pneumothorax developing. She had maybe 2 hours before it became critical. Maybe less. She paged respiratory therapy again. This time there was no answer. She called the ICU supervisor. Chen is fully assigned, the supervisor said, her voice apologetic but firm. Dr. Caldwell specifically requested he remain in ICU. Katie hung up and called Dr. Caldwell's office. The answering service picked up. Dr. Caldwell was in surgery and not to be disturbed. Of course he was. Of course he'd made sure he was unreachable the moment things began to deteriorate. She was standing at the bedside, calculating time and oxygen levels and exactly how much longer Marcus Chen could survive this neglect, when something shifted in her spine. It was small. It was quiet. It was the moment when the nurse stopped and the major took over. She'd trained for this. She'd done this before. Not with stethoscopes and pulse oximetry, but with mortar fire overhead and a child bleeding in her hands and the absolute certainty that the protocols didn't matter anymore, that what mattered was the patient and the skill in her hands and the training that lived in her muscle memory like a second skeleton. Marcus's oxygen saturation hit 78%, and Katie Morrison stopped asking for permission. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what would happen when she saved him anyway. The monitor alarm changed pitch at 0300 hours. Not the steady beep of normal fluctuation. Not the lazy warning tone of a dropped pressure reading. This was the sharp, escalating shriek of desaturation, oxygen saturation collapsing in real time, the machine's voice rising like it was screaming. Katie heard it from 30 feet away, from the post-op recovery station where she was signing off on discharge paperwork for a gallbladder patient who would never know how close she was to ignoring everything else. She recognized the specific pattern. The rhythm. The urgency compressed into electronic sound. Bed 7. Marcus Chen. Katie moved before her brain finished the thought. Feet off the ground. papers scattered across the desk. The fluorescent lights blurred overhead as she ran, her body moving with the terrible clarity of muscle memory that didn't care about job titles or doctor's orders or 8 hours of systematic dismantling. Her hands already knew what they needed to do. The monitor showed 68%. Dropping. 65, 62. The room was empty. No Dr. Caldwell. No respiratory therapist, of course not. Caldwell had reassigned him to another floor at shift change. No one at Marcus's bedside despite the screaming alarm that should have brought the entire trauma team running like their lives depended on it. The vent was running, still delivering oxygen, but something was wrong with his lungs. Something catastrophic. Katie could hear it in his breathing, shallow, rattled, desperate, could see his chest moving asymmetrically. Tension pneumothorax. Left lung collapsed. She didn't hesitate. She moved to his bedside, her hands already reaching into the cargo pocket of her scrubs where she'd kept certain items for 12 years even after the doctor said a civilian nurse would never need them again. The MRE wrapper was still there, folded and refolded until it was soft as tissue, kept in a waterproof bag beside her wallet. From Ramadi. From the field hospital. From the night she'd fashioned for emergency chest seals out of packaging and duct tape and prayer while artillery shells walked across the compound like footsteps. Her hands moved on their own. Found the wrapper. Tore it open. The crinkle of the material sounded impossibly loud in the empty room. She located the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomical compass for a chest decompression that regulations said she should never perform. But regulations were written by people who'd never watched a soldier's lungs collapse while everyone followed protocol and waited for authorization. Regulations didn't account for 8 hours of systematic neglect. Regulations assumed doctors would care. The needle was in her other pocket. A 14-gauge angiocath she'd carried since her discharge, against every rule, against every promise she'd made to herself about being a civilian now. Just a nurse. Not a major. Not someone who'd trained to keep people alive under mortar fire. The rush of air escaped as the needle penetrated, a soft hiss that sounded like relief. Like breathing itself returning. Katie placed the MRE wrapper over the puncture site and secured it with tape from the crash cart, creating a one-way valve that would let pressure escape but not let air collapse back in. 2 minutes. Maybe less. The monitor's tone changed. Not the frantic shriek anymore. The oxygen saturation climbing. 62, 68. 74, 82. The asymmetrical chest movement evening out. Marcus's body relaxing incrementally, his lungs expanding with the first easy breath he'd taken in hours. Sinus rhythm. Steady. His color shifting from the dusky blue of hypoxia back toward something approaching normal human pink. He would live. She'd saved him a second time, and this time she'd done it alone, with an MRE wrapper and hands that remembered things her civilian mind had spent 7 years trying to forget. The door burst open at 0312 hours. Dr. Caldwell froze in the doorway, his face processing what he was seeing. Katie's hand still steady at Marcus's chest. The improvised chest seal taped in place. The monitor showing climbing oxygen numbers. The patient breathing. Alive. His expression shifted through stages like tectonic plates moving, shock, then recognition, then something darker. Something that looked like rage but felt like control slipping through his fingers. What the hell are you doing? His voice was ice and calculation, not anger anymore. Anger was messy. This was precision. This was a man realizing his narrative had collapsed. Katie didn't answer. She stepped back from the bed and pulled out her phone, her movements deliberate, her posture something between a soldier and a nurse, between the two halves of herself that could finally stop pretending to be separate. The patient coded at 0300. You were unavailable. I performed emergency decompression. He's stable now. 10 words. Exactly the words required. Nothing more. No apology, no explanation, no request for forgiveness. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He moved to the monitor, read the numbers with the calculated expression of a man doing damage assessment. For 5 seconds, he said nothing. Then he turned and walked out, and Katie heard him speaking into his radio before he'd cleared the doorway. Security to ICU. Code 7, immediate. Unauthorized medical intervention. The security team arrived at 0315 hours. 2 officers, neither looking directly at Katie. One carried a box. The other carried what looked like an official document that nobody needed to read aloud for everyone to understand what it meant. Your badge, Nurse Morrison. She removed it from around her neck. It was warm from her body, and the temperature change when she handed it over felt like removing a piece of armor piece by piece. The magnetic strip, once scanned, would deactivate within minutes. Access denied. Employee terminated. Just like that. You're being escorted off the premises. You're not to return to patient care areas. Property removal will be supervised. Katie nodded. She didn't look at Marcus, though she could hear his breathing behind her, steady, regular, alive. He would probably never know that the woman who'd saved his life twice had just lost everything protecting his. They walked her through the corridors at 0330 hours. Past the fluorescent lights and the monitor stations and the nurse's station where someone had already heard about the firing. Sarah Chen, the charge nurse, looked up from her paperwork, and their eyes met for exactly 1 second before Sarah's filled with tears and she turned away. The locker room was quiet. By 15 hours, Katie had placed her work shoes in the bottom of her personal bag. The extra scrubs she kept for double shifts. The stethoscope her grandmother had given her when she'd graduated nursing school. A coffee mug with a hospital logo from 5 years of service. A supervisor she didn't recognize appeared with a form and a witness protocol. Sign acknowledging receipt of your termination letter. Insubordination, practicing outside scope of license, and repeated boundary violations with attending physicians. Katie signed. Her handwriting was steady. The woman signing wasn't the timid floor nurse anymore, wasn't the version of herself that had been systematically dismantled over 8 hours. But she wasn't Major Morrison anymore either. Not yet. She was something in between, suspended between identities, belonging nowhere. By dawn, the locker was empty. The personnel file was updated. The hospital had sanitized the entire situation with paperwork and protocol, turning her firing into a regulatory necessity rather than an act of retribution. Katie drove home in darkness, parked in her driveway at 0632 hours, and didn't go inside. The house felt like it belonged to someone else. Everything inside belonged to someone else, the civilian life she'd built, the quiet identity she'd constructed, the version of herself that had supposedly moved past the broken woman who'd limped out of a field hospital in Ramadi. She drove to Laurel Hill Cemetery on the east side of Philadelphia instead. The rain started as she walked to the grave. Light at first, then heavier, then the kind of rain that felt personal, like the sky was crying for her since she'd stopped allowing herself to do it 7 years ago. James Morrison, Captain, United States Army. The headstone was simple. No flourishes. Just a name and dates and the emblem of the 75th Ranger Regiment he'd served with before a training accident in Kentucky had taken him out of this world. She stood in the mud, rain soaking through her scrubs, through her jacket, until her shoes sank into the soft ground. The cemetery was empty. Just her and the dead and the rain hammering down like mortar fire on a distant roof. I failed again, James, she whispered to the headstone. Her voice was barely audible over the rainfall. I saved him twice. Once in Ramadi when he was a child, and tonight when he was a man. And they threw me away for it. Just like they did after the TBI. Just like the Army discarded Major Katie Morrison because a roadside bomb broke something inside her brain that the doctors said would never fully heal. The rain ran down her face, mixing with tears she finally allowed to fall. The first ones in 7 years. The one she'd kept locked behind professional composure and quiet dignity and the terrible strength of a woman who'd learned that showing weakness meant losing control of her narrative. I hid everything. Every medal, every citation, every moment of who I was. Because being Major Morrison hurt too much after losing you. And it didn't matter anyway. I still lost. The boy, my job, my identity again. I'm nowhere. I'm nothing. I'm just a woman in the rain at a cemetery, and I don't know who I am anymore. She stayed until the sun began its descent toward evening, until she was shivering, until her voice had worn itself hoarse against the rain. Until she had nothing left to give. Then her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number: Mom's locker is empty. I have the pictures. What should I do? Derek. Her son. At 17 years old, smart enough to understand that his mother's silence had cost her everything, and brave enough to do something about it. Katie texted back, nothing. Forget it. Move on. But even as she typed the words, she knew her son wasn't the forgetting type. He'd inherited something from his father, the belief that the right thing mattered more than the safe thing. And he'd inherited something from her too. The inability to let injustice stand. She drove home in the darkness, changed out of her scrubs, and waited for the phone to ring. That evening, Katie Morrison stood at her late husband's grave in the cold Philadelphia rain, mud soaking through her shoes like a penance she deserved. The headstone read James Morrison, 1982 to 2019, and the rain hammered against it like applause for a performance that had ended too soon. She'd come here 1,000 times in 5 years, but never like this. Never broken. I failed again, James, she whispered to the stone, her voice steady even as the rain soaked through her jacket. I saved the boy twice, and they threw me away for it. The cemetery was empty except for her. Rows of headstones stretched toward the darkening horizon, each one a story of a life completed, accounted for, finished. She wasn't finished. She was scattered. A former major reduced to a fired floor nurse. A woman who'd carried men 3 miles through enemy fire now couldn't protect a single patient from a man in a white coat. Her phone buzzed. A text from Derek, Mom. I'm coming to get you. She didn't answer. She couldn't. What would she say? That she'd lost her job? That the system had chewed her up and spit her out? That she was standing in the rain talking to a dead man about her failures? The headlights cut through the darkness before she heard the running feet. Derek Morrison was 17, lean and tall in a way that reminded her painfully of his father, and he was running through a cemetery at dusk with something wooden clutched against his chest. His hair was soaked. His breath came in gasps that had nothing to do with the run. Mom, he said, and the single word carried the weight of a decision made. They need to see these. The wooden case was mahogany, maybe 6 inches by 10, with a brass latch that had tarnished to the color of old blood. Katie recognized it immediately. Her service case. The one James had given her before she'd buried it in the back of the closet on the day of her medical discharge. The day she'd stopped being Major Katie Morrison and become just Katie. Derek, no. Her voice was flat. The rain dripped from her chin. We agreed. That case stays closed. You agreed, he said. I was 7. I didn't get a vote. He was already moving toward his car, parked at the cemetery gate. She reached for him, but he was faster, 17 and furious in the way only teenagers could be, carrying a case like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. Because he was right. It was. The hospital board meeting was in emergency session. For hours of heated discussion had already happened before Derek walked in carrying a 17-year-old certainty and a mother's buried truth. The conference room fell silent when he opened the case on the mahogany table. Inside, layered in protective plastic, were the service records. Decorations. A photo of Captain Katie Morrison at 26, standing in front of a field hospital in Ramadi with blood on her gloves and a look in her eyes that said she'd seen things no human should see. Letters of commendation. Medical credentials from field training that would make most civilian hospitals weep. My mother is Major Katie Morrison, United States Army, Derek said quietly. And you just fired her. The room didn't move. Didn't breathe. The fluorescent lights above them buzzed like insects waiting to feed on the corpse of a career about to be resurrected. Sarah Chen, the charge nurse who had testified against Katie just hours earlier, picked up the service file with trembling hands. Her eyes moved across the page, and her face went the color of old bone. She'd called Katie difficult. She'd said Katie didn't respect authority. She'd stood in this same room and condemned the only person who had ever fought to keep her nephew alive. Sarah's voice shook as she read aloud, Ramadi, 2004. Field Hospital Command under sustained mortar fire. Citation for Valor under fire. 17 lives saved during sustained enemy contact. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Meritorious Service Medal. Combat Medical Badge. The words hung in the air like shrapnel. Sarah's voice cracked on the last line. Actual tears were running down her face now. 17. She saved 17 people under enemy fire, and I said she was difficult. The door at the side of the conference room opened. A man in navy dress blue stepped inside, not tall, but the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. His face was carved from stone and his rank insignia read Command Master Chief. His name was Graves, and he'd been Marcus Chen's SEAL team leader. He walked to the table and picked up each decoration one at a time. Bronze Star with Valor. His voice was the sound of a tank idling in a garage. Slow. Heavy. Dangerous. The room held its breath. Purple Heart. He picked up the next citation, his eyes moving across the page with the precision of a man who'd read 1,000 after-action reports. Meritorious Service Medal. Dr. Caldwell's face drained of color. He tried to stand, but his legs didn't cooperate. He sat back down heavily, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. Combat Medical Badge, Graves said, and his voice grew harder with each word. That's what Major Katie Morrison was wearing under her scrubs when she saved your patient's life tonight using an improvised chest seal from an MRE wrapper. That's field medicine. That's 17 years of competence compressed into an action that took 45 seconds. Caldwell's hands were shaking. The FBI agent who'd been standing quietly in the corner, the one who'd been building a case against prescription fraud for 6 months, stepped forward now. Dr. Caldwell, the agent said, and each word was a nail in a coffin, we've completed our audit. 18 months of prescription diversions. Fentanyl, hydrocodone, methylphenidate. Patient charts altered to hide the discrepancies. A distribution network through 3 hospitals. Katie Morrison's observation of medication chart switching in the secure pharmacy on August 14 made her a witness to your operation. Caldwell's jaw clenched. His eyes flickered to the door, calculating. Every action you took afterward was strategic elimination of a threat, the agent continued. Staff reassignments designed to isolate her from patient care. Duty roster changes that removed her from trauma cases. Calls to the hospital board characterizing her as unstable. The supply closet confrontation. The parking lot humiliation. All documented. All designed to discredit her before she connected the dots between what she'd seen and Marcus Chen's clinical neglect. The agent opened a folder. Inside were printouts of medication logs, narcotics counts that didn't match, pharmacy access records. Dr. Caldwell didn't just ignore Marcus Chen, the agent said. He actively prevented his treatment because Nurse Morrison kept coming close to your operation. The reassigned respiratory therapist. The denied chest X-ray. The blocked crash cart. Those weren't clinical decisions. Those were tactical eliminations of witnesses. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside, hammering against the windows like judgment trying to get in. The medical board made its decision at 2 in the morning. Dr. Caldwell's medical license was revoked effective immediately. The FBI arrested him at 2:45, handcuffing him in the hospital parking lot where he'd humiliated Katie Morrison just 18 hours earlier. By dawn, the entire facility knew. The Philadelphia Inquirer had the story. The medical board issued a statement. 3 separate committees opened investigations into his conduct. Katie Morrison was offered full reinstatement with back pay totaling $47,000, a formal written apology, and restoration of her charge nurse position, effective immediately. She accepted on one condition: Marcus Chen received access to every experimental treatment available, no matter the cost. 2 years later, Katie Morrison ran the emergency department at Oak Creek Memorial. Her office was on the 4th floor, overlooking the city she'd adopted as her home. On the wall behind her desk hung 3 things: a photograph of James Morrison, alive and smiling, a framed citation from the Department of Defense, and the faded unit patch from Marcus Chen's jacket, no longer hidden, no longer shameful. It sat beside her bronze star, her Purple Heart, and a recent photograph of Marcus Chen standing with assistants, his legs shaking but holding, his face lit with the kind of hope that only comes after surviving the unsurvivable. On night shifts, sometimes Katie would walk the East Corridor and see a security guard mopping the floors of the wing Dr. Caldwell had once controlled. It was Caldwell himself, stripped of his medical license, his freedom, his reputation. Katie didn't speak to him. She didn't gloat. She simply acknowledged that some men fall so far they have to climb from below ground level, and then she returned to her patients. Upstairs in rehabilitation, Marcus Chen relearned to walk 3 times a week with experimental nerve regeneration therapy. Katie visited him on her days off, watching his progress with the eye of someone who understood that recovery was 90% stubbornness and 10% luck. He knew now, knew she was the soldier who'd saved him in Ramadi, knew she was the nurse who'd saved him again in the darkness of a hospital ER. "You carried me 3 miles, he'd said during one session, his voice rough from disuse. "Longest 3 miles of my life," Katie had answered. "Worth every step," Marcus said. Derek Morrison was pre-med now, working as an ER volunteer under his mother's supervision. She watched him with the careful attention of a woman who'd made every mistake possible and was determined her son would learn from her survival instead of her failures. Sarah Chen, the charge nurse who testified against Katie, became assistant director of nursing. During orientation for new staff, she told them about the night a floor nurse saved a paralyzed veteran's life and lost everything for it. She told them about the wooden case containing the truth. She told them what it meant to be wrong about someone, and what it cost to make it right. Katie Morrison stood at her husband's grave on the anniversary of his death, 2 years after that cold night in the rain. But this time she wasn't whispering failure into the darkness. "I found my way back, James," she said, and her voice was steady. "It took losing everything twice, but I'm finally both people, the major and the nurse. Turns out I never had to choose." She placed flowers on the headstone and drove back to Oak Creek Memorial for the night shift. The parking lot lights flickered as she pulled in, casting long shadows across the pavement. Above her, the emergency room lights burned bright and constant, waiting for the next crisis, the next impossible choice, the next moment when someone would need a doctor with steady hands and a spine made of something stronger than bone. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story moved you, subscribe for more about the people who served twice, first in uniform, then in scrubs. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your story. Because the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together.